Thank you, Ranjana. I'm Shreya from Impact Investors Council, and as Ranjana mentioned, this panel discussion is going to be a sector deep dive on emerging innovations in energy. Between today and tomorrow, we have four such sector deep dives. Again, as Ranjana mentioned, in parallel to this session, we have a sector deep dive on climate smart agriculture in Audi 2. So please feel free to move between Audis and attend the session of your choice. Now, coming back to emerging innovations in energy. All around the world, we are acutely aware of the burgeoning demand for energy and the imperative need to transition from fossil fuels to renewable, cleaner sources. With this in mind, the session will explore nuances, growth, and the future of innovative energy startup ecosystem in India. We have a stellar panel with us here today. This discussion will be moderated by Mr. Vikram Dileepan, who's the Vice President, Lok Capital. Lok Capital is one of the pioneering and leading base of pyramid-focused impact investing venture capital funds in India. To introduce the panelists briefly, our first panelist is Ms. Anjana Shashadri, who's the ESG officer, SBI NEEF Fund. So, since its inception in 2015, NEEF Fund has been providing growth capital to emerging and innovative SMEs on critical matters such as mitigating climate risks, promoting social development, job creation, and gender equality. Our second panelist is Mr. Arjun Gupta, founder and CEO of Smart Joules, a highly innovative climate tech startup with a mission to eliminate energy waste through innovations in continuous energy management. Our third panelist joining us is Mr. Devasis Goswami, who's the general manager, Shell E4. Shell E4 empowers Indian entrepreneurs working on energy-related startups to help them become more sustainable and significantly impactful organizations. Our next panelist is Mr. Danny Kennedy, who's the Chief Energy Officer, New Energy Nexus, and in the California Clean Energy Fund. New Energy Nexus supports clean energy entrepreneurs with funds, accelerators, and networks, and has operations in China, India, Southeast Asia, and East Africa. And finally, we also have with us on the panel Mr. Sameer Shah, who's the managing partner, Peak Ventures. Peak Ventures is one of the leading early stage sustainability ventures in India that supports entrepreneurs who want to create a low carbon economy. Over to you, Vikram, to take this discussion forward.
Thank you, Shreya. Thanks for the introduction. Well done. So I'd like to start by thanking all the panelists taking their valuable time out and giving their opinion on what's happening in India climate tech, specifically in the innovations in the energy tech space today. To begin with, I would like to start addressing with Danny, and then this is going to be more of a freewheeling discussion. So I'm expecting all of us to just jump in and express our views on the topics at hand. But to begin with, I would like to bring a global context compared to what's happening in the developed markets and the renewed interest after the IPCC report globally, and then start with how that compares with what's happening in the Indian ecosystem. So starting with Danny. Danny, thanks for being with us here today. I'm really enthused by your interest in the Indian ecosystem of climate and energy via a New Energy Nexus. So this would be a general question, but perhaps you can shed a bit more light to give a cross-border perspective and what's happening in India with respect to what's happening in the US, and why do you find India to be one of the more dynamic markets as far as energy innovations and climate innovations are concerned?
I think India is tracking pretty closely, and as in many markets, leading segments and innovation in the energy transition that's going to really accelerate this decade. I mean, here in the United States, there's a lot of hype right now around the 45% solar goals just announced by the Biden administration for the country. We're now acknowledging what we knew to be true 10 years ago, but no one wanted to say, which is that solar is going to dominate the electricity supply because it is the cheapest form of generation in the history of the world. And that will take market share just progressively. And that will ramp this decade in a way that we, have to get used to in our heads, kind of like cell phones took over the last decade from landlines completely. Solar will start to do that now. India's been on that ramp, at least for utility scale stuff, so to ask about innovation, I'm fascinated by all the improvements, the incremental improvements to make it even further lower cost, to continue to drive that learning curve, another 80% reduction in price of end electricity in solar, for example. a lot of that's going to be around mounting, so in Asia, we're seeing really interesting photovoltaics. I'm fascinated by the Singaporean experiment in sea-mounted solar installation, which is just like, wow, that's incredibly low cost. If you can put the stuff on the ocean, what's it going to be per kilowatt hour? It's going to be low cost. So I think India likewise has innovated a lot of that at large scale. I think where there's still work to be done is integrating into the cities of India, the rooftop markets. Around the edges of that is, a whole bunch of power electronics and storage technology, which, clearly we're doing a lot of in the States. Here in California, we've just 10x'd our grid storage market in a year. In the new Californian budget, we put another couple of $2 billion down just to promote that. The use now of vehicles as a kind of storage, batteries on wheels. The Chinese have really been pioneering that in their energy internet strategy. But the fact that, you now have 10% of cars sold in a given month being electric in China means you have, many gigawatt hours of storage rolling into garages, even if those are not V2G assets yet, they're certainly demand response assets, and they're being used as such in grids here in the US, in China, and elsewhere. And I think India, with the 2-wheel and 3-wheel electrification that's happening at scale and speed, is going to be another market where that really grows. And then the final thing I'll say is just, we're very interested at New Energy Nexus around the world in finance technology innovations, and then digital fintech, to really accelerate some of the uptake, particularly in energy access markets, the pay-as-you-go mobile money systems that have enabled a lot of East Africa, for example, to adopt solar home systems and the like. How do we leverage further digital fintech, digital payment strategies, all these things to defray the capex of generation and storage and the energy transition? And India is, front and center of the digital revolution in the world, the cities of India, the software engineers, the potential for that to come from India, that transition and radical transformation of how we pay and manage the credit and debt financing of the massive energy transition we're about to start is obvious. So I would, all those ideas in one. Hope that wasn't too big a dump, Vikram.
So that was quite good, Danny, because you brought about a number of points which are very important, like the digital confluence of digital penetration, as well as the leapfrogging that we see of most financial institutions into fintech companies rather than a traditional NBFC, as the case has been. So we are at the nexus, so to speak, of an interesting point in our evolution, where we have fintech, energy, and the grid penetration, internet penetration, rising middle class power, all of it coming together. So which brings me to another rather interesting question, is that I think Debashish and Samir and Anjana could answer this very well. Is there enough entrepreneurial talent, or is there an ecosystem of innovators in this nexus who are willing to take advantage of the opportunities that are arising? What is the base of the pyramid entrepreneurial talent that you see in this segment? Perhaps Debashish could go first, considering his involvement and what he's doing with Shell Ventures. I'd be very interested to hear from the other panelists as well.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Vikram, for the question. I think with the interesting question, I think you put across, we see this emerging opportunity across clean tech, and especially with reference to the multiple initiatives that are being launched from an India-specific standpoint, right? So, and we see that the startup ecosystem has responded pretty well. So we have, as a part of Shell E4, we drive very specific, kind of tracks and initiatives working with startups in the energy space. And with that, what we are saying is we kind of regularly look into the ecosystem as in how the startup ecosystem is evolving in this specific energy, clean tech area. And we see that there are a lot of very interesting startups which are starting to emerge in spaces like biofuels, and also in spaces like, for example, energy storage, new battery chemistry. I think we have seen very good high quality startups emerging from some of the colleges and institutions, be it IITs and others, and we see that there's a lot of involvement from, say, even the kind of the professorial stuff, the research stuff, who are also kind of getting into this entrepreneurial ecosystem as such, and really contributing in this journey. And I would say that there has been a very upward tick in terms of the kind of startups we are seeing, and I think numbers on the rise. I don't want to quote an exact number, but we every year we see a lot of very interesting startups, and we typically work with about 20 odd startups every year who are in these specific spaces, and we see that growing very very dynamically as we speak in India. Yeah.
So Vikram, if I may go next, actually.
Sure, Samir.
I think I would just like to add a couple of comments to what Danny said. While India, as he rightly said, is leading the solar revolution, if you look at the government's announcements in the last several weeks, there have also been focus on biofuels, and to say that, look, we should have a 20% mix of ethanol with respect to our energy. And today, every day you will see one or two articles or a discussion on hydrogen. So these two are also, contenders with respect to the transition or energy transition from what has been led by fossil fuels. I mean, today out of the 360 gigawatts of energy, about 68, 69% is still fossil fuels. But that transition is changing quickly. And these technologies are also emerging in addition to solar, which would mean that, the replacement of fossil fuel is not going to come from one renewable energy. It is also going to come from multiples. And even in solar, actually, I think you have seen a move from thin film to, polysilicon, but now you're seeing perovskites come in, as well as heterojunction technologies, because sometimes we reach a chemical limitation as to what is the efficiency of 27, 28%, which is a comment that was made earlier about energy efficiency. So by moving to new technologies and seeing how this whole space develops would be, in my mind, a fascinating and multifaceted, revolution. I mean, many of you may have heard the term SATAT, but that is called Sustainable Alternative Towards Affordable Transportation, where we are talking about waste to energy technologies where Germany has got 10,000 anaerobic digesters, and we are trying to say, look, how can we do 4,000? Which at scale can be $26 billion of opportunity. So I think, if you have to change the equation, you have to think big, you have to think outside the box, you have to think to see what you can support. And at the ecosystem level as well, I think, one of the companies we had supported early on is a company called Ion Energy, which demystifies the EV battery space to say, look, cell manufacturing is a domain of larger players, form factor is less relevant, IoT many people can do. But if you can work on energy efficiency or thermal management, those are the kind of things where, one of the first companies to attract investment from the Amazon Climate Fund. So I would say that the entrepreneurial ecosystem, and Debashish obviously is much more closer to it, but we are as well, is thriving. And I think it's you need to find the quality entrepreneurs effectively who can, make the difference and assist India in the transition from a fossil fuel future. I think just one last comment before I address your question is that you can't always think of energy as a cost. You always also have to think about energy security. So cost and security go hand in hand. And, with the whole geopolitics currently going on, I mean, one would argue that, look, even if we have solar, but we are importing 80% plus of the panels, is that giving us enough energy security? If you are going towards lithium ion, but a majority of it is the core metal of lithium and cobalt are not in the country, why do we not think of hydrogen and biofuels, which can be done at a decentralized level from local sources? So I think we are seeing a number of companies. In fact, we have a few investments. I'll just mention the names, but we'll talk during the course of the conversation. Like Gist Vari Energy is one of our companies, just filing a DRHP for doing an IPO, which will be the first solar exit from an IPO for a investor. And, a company which is democratizing sustainability globally called GIST. So, we'll talk about that. But I think a short answer to your question is that this energy transition and the, growth of entrepreneurs, either within large institutions and universities, but even otherwise, and mature entrepreneurs trying to solve tough problems is the kind of people we like to work with.
Very interesting. I think Anjana might also want to contribute to that point, considering that she's also close to the entrepreneurial talent in addition to Lok. So Anjana.
Thank you. Yes, so from Need Fund, we've actually invested into 10 companies, and this is a diverse set of investments across climate, environment, and social enterprises. But we have an exposure to the climate and environment sector on 70% of our portfolio. And like Debashish and Samir mentioned, that we should not just look at solar and wind as the only sources of renewable power. And in fact, even in our plethora of investments that we've made, we have only one in the sector of solar and wind, and then we thereon went on to make investments in biomass to energy sector as well as the waste to energy platform. And as Samir also mentioned, the Satat scheme as well as the biofuel policy. So very, very close to that. In fact, one of the entrepreneurial challenges that we initially observed was, while there is a lot of access to equity and growth stage equity that's available to the entrepreneurs, there's actually little understanding in the debt system as to how to appraise these projects, and especially, they only looked at from the perspective of working capital. So we really worked with the ecosystem as well, and considered that this is not just the mandate of the fund, but it's our responsibility to the entire sector as a whole to work with our companies to help them build the policy and to overcome market failures as well, so that they are able to access that debt and access blended finance as well. One of the key achievements that we worked with was in the biomass sector. Biomass earlier was not recognized as a renewable fuel, especially the offtake of steam from biomass. And we worked very closely with the Ministry of Non-Renewable Energy and helped them acquire an industry status to steam offtake from biomass. And then thereafter, we saw the cascading effects of that the funding ecosystem, especially debt, started recognizing them as a project that could be funded. And then you could actually get a rate of interest that is, slightly marginally lower than what they would get as a working capital loan or any other form of loan if they would go to the banking system. So along with the building an entrepreneurial ecosystem, there are also a lot of ecosystem building activities that need to be done, and that also is very key to the work that Need Fund does. Also, Vikram, you mentioned that, what is the presence or coverage across the rest of India or all of India across the portfolio. I mean, one of our earlier mandates in Need Fund 1 was to actually invest into the lower income regions, and the reason for that was that private equity does not typically flow into low income regions. And it was also a challenge that we took on, and then we realized that there was actually a lot of talent available there, and there is a lot of impact to be created. And today, as we speak, our fund is impacting nearly 4 million people across a plethora of initiatives. This is across energy conservation, this is across and access to energy, education, as well as access to healthcare. So it's a cross-cutting a subject across various impacts. Also, like Danny mentioned, that we should not just look at the cost of energy. We should also understand what are the mitigation and adaptation measures that our investments could have. That also is a strategy that we have adopted as we appraise investments. We look at the potential across mitigation and adaptation both for all the investments that we make.
Thank you, Ajna. That was very helpful. I think what all of you mentioned was quite interesting, that we should adopt more decentralized technologies rather than just lowering the cost of solar power, look at accessing blended finance for the entrepreneurial community in addition to just equity, which brings me to a very interesting question. Rather, I've always wondered about this point. Since I've been an entrepreneur in the solar energy space, especially selling to small, medium enterprises, there was always a resistance to kind of look at investment into clean technologies at the decentralized level from a purely cost return perspective, considering that solar used to be very highly priced at that point of time compared to what it is now. And I think Arjun is the best person to answer this question, whether that outlook of the average industry or the small business has changed now, considering that it must have moved from not just from a cost perspective, but more from a climate perspective and a decarbonization perspective. What is your take on the consumer outlook, or rather the business outlook, to invest into clean tech in India, Arjun?
Thanks for the question, Vikram. Unfortunately, my answer is not going to be very positive. The question is really important. And there's two parts to it. One is sustainability imperative for these businesses? I think the answer it ought to be, because investors are looking at ESG, the customers are demanding more sustainable products and services, the talent that works there is wanting to work for companies that are good instead of bad. And the customers are also, so they're getting pressure from everywhere, and this will increase in the future as well. But that is, how it ought to be. How it is on the ground is that the top management of these companies, while they are all reading the news and they're like, yes, we should do something good, they are not taking it up as their personal, it's one of their personal goals. So what they do is they tell their teams, finance team do something, engineering team do something, but it doesn't show up in any of their KRAs, unfortunately. So, the adoption of good solutions is horribly slow and is changing very slowly as well. The increase in adoption is also quite slow. So I think, the ecosystem is really well set up in terms of the finance ecosystem. I'm so happy to hear from all the colleagues here on the call. That ecosystem is really ramping up fast. The innovation ecosystem is also ramping up really fast. So, I've co-founded an organization called the Sustainability Mafia. Here we have 50 clean tech entrepreneurs from all over India, and we are trying to help each other, to create some of the best clean tech companies in the world. But so, the innovation ecosystem is good, the financing ecosystem is good, the uptake ecosystem is really, really poor. Whether you talk about companies or you talk about governments, there's not enough action there. So one has to really do a lot to be able to get traction with real demand. So I think we all need to do a lot more on the demand side of things. Yep.
So Arjun, a silver lining to what you're saying is that we have funded an NBFC called Metafin Clean Tech Finance, whose sole role is financing rooftop solar in the country. And we are doing small rooftop systems. While I agree with you, the adoption is not as fast as it should be, but the train has left the station. I think it is beginning. And we are looking at funding Aata Chakkis. And where the fintech comes in is we are funding entrepreneurs who don't have a P&L and balance sheet. We actually have a person go and sit at the Aata Chakki to look at their books to see, what is it that they are doing, and using alternative means of assessing financial repayment capability. And, we are looking to do 20 such cases in UP within the next 60 days. Through this. So I think it's beginning, but I do agree with you. It could be a lot faster.
You're right in the sense that it is starting to take off, but we could definitely see more action in the financing ecosystem at least. Some ray of hope is on the horizon. We are getting a lot of interest from global funds. We like Samir mentioned, Amazon Climate Fund and Union Square Ventures. And Danny's here. Danny has cut his teeth in solar as a service in multiple countries and many different business models. So I'm very keen to hear on the venture ecosystem and what's been happening there from maybe Danny, Samir, and Anjana as to what do you think is attractive as a fundable business model or a scalable business model from a venture perspective? Because venture funds come in with, be it global or Indian, they come in with a very short horizon of 5 to 7 years. And some of us might have a little more patience at our stake. Say, Lok was looking at a slightly longer horizon as well. And I'm sure Anjana would like to chime in as that well. But very keen to hear from the panel on what's happening on the venture ecosystem, both from an Indian and a global fund perspective.
I'll just jump in to start to say, firstly, I think venture pure as it never was, but as it's methodologically understood to be, is not really appropriate for clean energy transitions. We've worked that out in California now, as you mentioned, the short timelines, the expectations of unicorns, all the madness that venture capitalists are laboring under is not right when you're trying to do high capex deals and companies of the kind of duration and infrastructure that we have. So venture is, while it's flooded with capital right now, there's an unbelievable amount of money in the world that's not doing a lot. So there's a lot of LPs wanting to throw some into the hands of any money manager that sticks up a shingle and says, I know something about climate tech. The good ones, I think, are doing a couple of things differently. One is, following patterns. Go to India and recognize that, this MNDC that Samir mentioned is, just begun, just started to scratch the surface. How many small roofs are there in India? Hundreds of millions of them. So, how do you do that kind of like Mosaic and Lone Pal and Goodleap and all these companies in the States have done in the States, while only scratching the surface of the US as well, I should mention. 2 million out of 80 million roofs have been touched in the United States yet. So that market is going to be huge. So there's sort of a pattern recognition and following strategy to emerging markets as they grow and come up that exponential curve quickly. The other point would be blended finance facilities, where you don't just do venture equity. You go into a company with the strategy to also do their debt financing over time, whether that's the working capital or whether that's the longer term project finance that they're going to need for the things they deploy. So a lot of funds are taking a bigger life cycle strategy. They're not just there aren't enough deals and they're not big enough to consume all the equity available unless they can grow and have debt financing facilities lined up to deploy their products and services. There's not enough deals of deployment to do for pure debt players unless they invest in the venture side and the equity requirements of the startups. And so there's a lot of funds that are emerging to do both and, which I think is smart.
I think Vikram, if I may jump in.
Sure,
so,
sir.
I mean, as is always, there is a case for multiple viewpoints on a subject. So I would offer a different point of view, actually. So from where we sit and we are putting our money where our mouth is, where we are building a sustainability-oriented fund, focusing on energy, water, agriculture, climate tech, and we will have a global focus. So I will just share opportunities which we have invested in. And I think, when you mention solar, it is not our intent to invest in solar farms. We leave that to the pension funds who want to have a pension fund type return. But if you look at a company called Vari Energies, which has built a solar panel business, and it's Hitesh Doshi, whom I've supported since 2015, we have made, we are just about to do an IPO. I can mention it because it is in the press. So that will be the first solar IPO, which will multiply our investment, small amounts, but at the same time, we have invested with K Capital in a company called HST Solar out of California. So as of today, they have an optimization software that has been used for over 300 gigawatts in 100 countries, over 7,500 projects. So you tell me whether this is a scaled opportunity or not. Ion Energy, I mentioned, I won't repeat. Another interesting investment, which has also done very well, is a company called GIST Advisory. GIST is based out of Switzerland, and I'm on the executive committee of that. It stands for Global Initiative for a Sustainable Tomorrow, run by an individual called Pawan Sukhdev, and we should all as Indians be proud that he won the Tyler Prize for the Environment this 2020, which is considered the equivalent of the Nobel Prize. So we are attempting to democratize sustainability globally. So these are early stage investments where we are getting some very, very large data providers almost ready to sign up. I can't mention names because it's not signed yet. But I see tremendous opportunity in this space, but one has to focus as a venture fund in the non-tech space. Non-infra space. Like lithium ion in my mind is yesterday's story. I mean, I would be focusing more on sodium ion. I met a company which did actually did a SPAC doing solid state batteries out of Stanford, but it was too early for us to invest. We looked at a company called SMC doing switch reluctance motors. We just got a $200 million check from BMW. I mean, we had the opportunity to invest last year, but the check they demanded was higher than what we could pay pre-funding. But this switch reluctance motors will be used whether you use EVs or you use a normal ICE vehicle. But energy efficiency is here to stay. Just because cost has come down doesn't make energy efficiency redundant. It just said because the CO2 emissions doesn't change whether your cost of energy is 5 rupees or 2 rupees. It's the same energy. It's almost like, one has to think about what is the carbon intensity of the economy. And that is a composition of what is the carbon intensity of energy plus the resource intensity of your economy. And a country like India, the resource intensity will be very high because we're building infrastructure, we are building buildings. So, but the extent to which we can reduce the carbon intensity of our energy production, that can go huge ways. And to be honest, the sustainability goals of the world cannot be met without India's active participation. I mean, we are the third largest contributor country, whatever. So I think I am actually tremendously bullish on the venture space in this. We can't talk about the others because this is only about energy, but we just funded a plant-based protein company. We just looked at a water company which is doing electrocoagulation with respect to doing wastewater. So while people talk about net zero, one should not forget that the natural capital consists of wastewater, it consists of multiple, if you look at planetary boundaries, which is a concept promoted by a Swedish organization and well known as well globally. There are other aspects of the whole transition that also need to be considered. So I think we leave the infrastructure investment for the pension funds, but there are sufficient, our EWF, which is Energy Web Foundation, where we have invested at $2, is today listed at $11. So this is a 5x or more than in 2 years. So I would say that there are returns available, there are exits available. And, this is run by Rocky Mountain Institute, which is one of the most pioneering institutions in EVs. So I think being careful, looking deeper, looking harder, and finding the right entrepreneurs to back will give you venture returns, which give you positive financial returns and the satisfaction of positive externalities.
Thank you, Samir. I think what you said is true in a lot of sense. And I also agree with most of the points that Danny made here as well.
Sure.
But I would still, having come from a background of being an entrepreneur and then transitioning into an investor, especially in the climate tech space, what I do see is that funds such as Neve, Anjana would agree, have invested in infrastructure in the past. But having said that, there is still a gap between mainstream opportunistic infrastructure and then pure play equity finance, which is where I would like to hear a little bit more about what are corporates like Shell, what are corporates like NG or BP doing apart from accelerating? Are they, and perhaps Anjana and Arjun can also chime in as to how to access these borderline opportunities that are somewhere between pure play venture fundable scalable models and infrastructure, where you still need blended capital, you still need quasi infrastructure, quasi equity finance, but you would still need to find a way to give the returns to your investor, be it a infrastructure fund or an opportunistic infra fund or a venture investor, as for that matter. Perhaps Arjun can start a little bit about how to access capital, and then Debashish and Jana can give us some opinions on how to access the corporate wallet, so to speak.
Yeah, sure. Our business is an energy efficiency business, and it actually takes in all kinds of capital, venture capital, debt capital, blended capital, and have actually been able to use all of these types of capital. And the good news is that all of these types of capital do exist. And then there's a lot of good funders around who have the money to be able to invest in good projects, good companies. So I think finance is a problem that is getting solved very well in India at this moment. Your question about bigger companies like the NGs of the world and the BPs of the world, I think these companies are also getting more nimble, and they are on the hunt and looking out for solutions they can help scale. Because one thing that they know how to do is to scale, right? And then as entrepreneurs, we are always thinking about how to scale. These companies know how to scale, and they are looking out for companies, startups that they can somehow collaborate with and help scale with the systems and the kind of operational capabilities that they have. And one of the things that I'm very happy to see is one of the initiatives that Danny is involved in, which is Third Derivative, which brings in some of these companies, the big companies into the game early on, and kind of makes it a structured program for entrepreneurs to collaborate from the beginning. So I think this is really important, and we are seeing good signs for this happening more and more.
Yeah, can I just jump in, Vikram? I'm sorry if I was misunderstood up top. I'm not saying there aren't great entrepreneurs doing incredible things, and many in India. New Energy Nexus India is one of our most exciting geos by far and away. my point was attempting to say the model of venture capital that we kind of have in our heads from the stories of the turn of the century in California are not applicable, and we need to innovate in order to accelerate this energy transition and the success of these entrepreneurs. You know, New Energy Nexus, we have 500 companies in our various portfolios around the world today. It's not like we're not in the game and seeing exits like Samir's seeing, and some of them are 5Xs and, you know, some of them are 10Xs. Hell, we were in Tesla. We sold when they went public from their Series A. Like, been there, done that, been on the ride. The point is, most of the companies will not do the 10X. We have to get comfortable with the 2 and 3X, but a long, long tail of a lot of debt financing and a lot of infrastructure financing, because what we're doing is we're rewiring the world.
Yeah.
And that doesn't look like, you know, Facebook, sadly, for the investors. They don't get that stupid return. Good for the world, because we're not building Facebook. We're building something that's useful and doesn't destroy our democracies and depress our children. We're building sunshine-based energy systems to deliver power to the world. So, you know, I think it's a very exciting time, but it does require this innovation by us as investors and different ways of thinking and partnering with the big end of town. You know, Third Derivative is a great example. This is a joint venture we have with Rocky Mountain Institute to build an ecosystem thesis of big corporates, you know, Microsoft, Wells Fargo, you name it, the blue chips of America, with investors, angels through VCs, traditional VCs, with 50 startups right now, and, you know, dozens more to come, and see how we can bring them all together to advance faster the success of these technologies into market. Conventional investment tracks, you know, Series A equity, Ponzi scheme to Series B to Series C, debt financiers 10 years later, doesn't do that, basically.
Got it. Thank you, Danny, for the colorful explanation. Really appreciate it. Debashish,
Vikram, if I could just come in for a moment here. So our role from Me Fund essentially comes in when the company is in the growth stage. So our role is to actually identify those early bloomers and who can take their technology to scale, and that's what we have endeavored to do. And while you speak about infrastructure, we've also looked at companies who have technologies, scalable technologies in emission controls, in energy efficiency. And currently we're looking at a lot of those companies to be invested into from our second fund, which is Me Fund 2, because our first fund, Me Fund 1, is now completely invested, of course. So we are building an ecosystem where we can take these companies, the growth stage companies, to scale. And we're seeing a lot of traction in different kinds of renewable energy products, not just solar and wind. And there are a lot of new technologies, like Samir mentioned. There's also water and waste that we are looking at. Within that specifically, ETPs, STPs, because that's the need of the hour. These are issues that have been ignored for so long, and they really need solutions. Also, there are a lot of new technologies that are available in these sectors, especially extraction of methane gas to energy, and these are indigenous problems. These are not problems that replicate perhaps the developed world, but are very rooted to India's problems.
Vikram, just 2 points from my side. I think I completely agree with what Danny said, that the returns that an investor should look for. This is not tech as in the classic eyeballs and you just get SaaS-based, number of the growth. Any energy transition, whether you look at it globally, and whether you look at how France has developed into nuclear at 76%, or Denmark has done in wind energy, where 55% comes from wind, or Iceland in geothermal, or Brazil. If you study all these systems, this is a multi-year process. So I agree, investors have to be patient investors. But if you look at a return perspective, investing in the right technologies, at that time, Volkswagen developed the flexi-fuel car, which just changed the dynamics of the equation. So change can happen. It's sometimes not uniform, and it will happen in somewhat fits and starts. But one has to accept that energy transitions are not smooth journeys at 50 kilometers an hour. They will have their, growth phases and stabilization phases. But that doesn't change the fact that this needs to happen. I mean, the move from fossil fuels into, other areas of technology. And someone asked, what is the cleanest form of energy? I think the cleanest form of energy is energy you don't use, which means that, it brings into account energy conservation, energy efficiency, and which other factors as well, which all need to play a part. One comment before I get back to you. I mean, there's so much discussion on net zero, which is about emissions. But if one looks at the natural capital cycles, I mean, you have to talk, as was just mentioned, Anjana, I mean, you have to think about what is happening to water, what is happening to land use change, what is happening to waste management. I mean, planetary boundaries in terms of other aspects are also high. So while it is clear that there has to be an emphasis on net zero, to be focused on net zero at the exclusion or of all other natural capital priorities is my mind looking for an incomplete solution. To see that, look, we have to manage the planetary boundaries across all the other parameters which have been well defined.
Thank you, Samir. That was very helpful. Before we close out, I would like to take some questions from the audience as well, especially the most interesting ones for both the audience as well as the panelists here, considering the quorum. One of the questions that have been repeated time and again is, utility scale solar has seen, or utility scale wind as for that matter, has seen a lot of investment interest. But more from a commercially fundable model ranging across the climate tech spectrum, some of the, notwithstanding the opportunities that Samir pointed out, what will it take for investors to invest in companies beyond the infrastructure space? What kind of models do you see out there in the mobility space, in the plant protein space, or even the energy tech space that are quite interesting? And I mean, from a load perspective, I could say we are seeing mobility as a service, digital lending for electric vehicles, novel electric OEMs coming up, and very interesting plant protein companies that are coming up. And these are interesting to us as a fund, and we are looking at scaling these opportunities up. And I'd love to hear from the panelists as well as to what kind of interesting models you're seeing across the spectrum.
I mean, I'll just jump in.
First, or Danny could go first.
Yeah, sure.
So, I'm loving the kind of software players, HST that Samir mentioned is a company we supported a few years ago. But there's going to be many layers of intelligence that makes this all work. And, your Discom market in India needs fixing. New Energy Next has been running the Electron Vibe program to help do that. The investment in the startups that are going to fix the Discoms would be a really ripe, fertile ground, I think. The Indian 2- and 3-wheel vehicle miles traveled markets and the financing of electrification of those rickshaws and the stations, that's a fascinating place with 3 Wheels United and companies like that. The energy efficiency continues. The ESCO pay-as-you-save stuff continues to be really fascinating. The digital fintech that may be behind it. So those software companies that, angel investors and small VCs can make a difference for without the sort of infrastructure spending. There's no end of exciting spaces where active but patient investors can get behind entrepreneurs and help them succeed with their capital and with their connections. I mean, investments should be more than just money. And so you pick your partners and how you're going to help them get down the line based on what experience and networks you bring, as well as the capital and the returns you want.
Debashish, you're close to the innovation ecosystem. I'd love to hear a little bit more about what kind of companies Shell E4 is looking at and what does your cohorts consist of?
Yeah. No, I think so when we look at the basic themes and the approach, so we are looking at a couple of options. One is how do we kind of start looking at the early stage startup ecosystem, really help them build the next level of, if I say, the energy startup ecosystem in India. That is one of the key mandates for us. We are also actively working on building the tier 2 ecosystem, right? So how do we take it beyond the bigger Bangalore, Bombay kind of ecosystem, and we actively work with various institutional incubators, for example, right now, where we're trying to kind of build and work with early stage startups on that front. From the E4 view, I think we primarily focus on, say, pre-Series A kind of startups who who need that support and that guidance to really scale up their startups and operations. And because we see that one of the key challenges is how do we kind of scale from pilots? The whole journey from pilot to scale is kind of the most important phase, if I may say, in terms of really building an emerging country or emerging nation's startup model, if I may say. And that is where we try to play a role in terms of helping them with the lab, the infrastructure, and in terms of the pilot opportunities that we can provide to them. And again, when in this whole journey, in this whole energy transition pathway, and every organization, be it Shell and others, have their own mandates to look at how we want to kind of look at building a cleaner world, basically, right? And in that journey, we are looking at engaging with the startups as a very interesting approach to kind of looking at the portfolio going forward. So if we have targets of, for example, putting in, say, a few 100,000, energy EV charging points, and we say that why not we start working with so many of the charge point providers and see if they can kind of be an enabler in that direction. So if we are saying that we want to provide energy access to 100 million end users in emerging countries, so how do we kind of do that? And those things can be enabled much more quickly by working with startups in that space. And we also, as have been working with startups in this whole gamut, early stage to a late stage startup like a Rapido or a Huskpower, in which we have invested. And we also, like, as I said, working with very early stage startups who look at the fundamental support in terms of validation, in terms of access to labs, in terms of access to mentorship, in access to domain support. And in that regard, we have seen that very interesting startups are out there. And every year we work with almost about 20 odd startups, and we have seen extremely high quality startups coming out of the Indian ecosystem. It's only about building scale from here, and I think that is where we would be working very closely with the startup ecosystem.
I think you're right, Debashish, but I think the more fundamental aspect is the community of people who are necessary to take this forward from the innovation stage to scale, the talent availability, which is where I'd like to hear a little bit more from Arjun on what the work he's doing with Sustainability Mafia. And in this day and age where most of the talent is carried away into the glamour of pure play tech ecosystems, how do you see Sustainability Mafia playing a role, or what else can be done to encourage high quality talent to come into the ecosystem?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think the most critical resource in India at the moment is talent. It's not money, it's nothing else, it's just talent. That's number one. So, as you said, most of our best people just leave. They go other places, they might as well go and work in a Tesla rather than an Indian automotive company. So, I think a number of things need to happen. We are trying to do some of the things in Sustainability Mafia. First of all, just to give support to the entrepreneurs. So, for example, if I'm looking for a really great person, it might be really hard for me to find one. But if I'm a part of an ecosystem of 50 entrepreneurs, they are going to know somebody who's really good that I might want to use in my company, and vice versa. So, it's kind of that ecosystem that we're creating so that our resources are multiplied by the number of people who are in that ecosystem. And the close collaboration from time to time. Second is, I think we need to work more closely with the demand center. So we are actually bringing in companies. For example, we have a program called Corporaro, and in that program we have a company like Diageo. It's a big company, and they come out and they throw challenges at us. They say, this is our problem. We are looking for a very good packaging solution with these 4 characteristics. Now that problem is thrown at us in the Mafia with 50 entrepreneurs, we're going to find the solution for them. And if we can't find that, we'll build it. So, now that's the kind of formation of a really great company, because guess what? If this is a problem, it is also every single beverage company's problem. And not only beverage, other companies' problems too. So, I think one good thing is that, you mentioned the sexy SaaS thing. These days, climate tech is sexy. It's overtaken SaaS, and it's way more sexy than anything else. So that's good. But talent is something we need to continue working on. And what we're trying to do is collaborate and grow our networks beyond our own reach. But it's still an uphill battle. And I would appeal to all the venture capitalists out here, as you look at innovative financial models, as you look at innovative XYZ things, please help your companies, your portfolio companies with talent. Think about how you are going to bring the talent into the companies where you are investing. And that's going to make the biggest difference. So, it's a clear appeal to all of you guys.
Vikram, can I add just one comment actually? So I agree with what has been said. Just, there's an overemphasis which has been on mobility. But, the next, if you look at overall net energy consumption, you have steel and cement, which need to decarbonize. They use 8% of the final energy demand. And building insulation, building heating and cooling buildings, as Danny would attest, costs 42% of the energy in the US. So these are also sectors to not lose sight of. And in India, I think the move towards EV also helps from an energy security standpoint, which I just mentioned. So in India, 81% of India's mobility-related energy needs are met through imports. So if we substitute it with EVs, you are using the charging network. Today, after 380 gigawatts, we have about 65% utilization. So you are having more utilization of a fixed asset. And at the same time, you're saving on imports of petrol and fuel, which are consumables, which means that, it helps in the FX balance position as well. So I guess what I'm saying is that the move towards EVs has to be viewed from a multifaceted perspective, that you're increasing energy, sort of obviously security. We are using the existing grid network, which is there. I mean, you have 380 gigawatts, which are not being used to the fullest extent. And you are also at the same time, I guess EVs, I know in my mind, are not completely green because all you have done is separate the point of consumption from the point of production. But by doing that, where you're consuming in a more populated area and you're producing in a less populated area, there's a marginal benefit on an overall equation basis as well. So these are also areas of increased focus. I mean, we are spending a lot of time on thinking about which technologies will decarbonize steel, cement, are there substitute materials that you can use? Because just as you talk about energy efficiency, you also have to talk about resource intensity, which is a different, obviously concept, but equally important in terms of how we build India's future.
Thank you, Samir. I think that those points make a lot of sense. But coming back to your point about EV still not being green, this is a problem that many of us have considered long and hard about how to make the whole value chain green, right? And that's where things like decarbonizing with blockchain and figuring out how to offset it with a climate token, all of these issues come into play. And that is the intersection between government policies, how liberal the policies are towards tokenization of climate records, and making the value chain green, not just polluting in a certain corner of the world and making the rest of the value chain green. Which brings me to a point about active regulatory intervention in many of these bottlenecks, right? And do you think there is a need for us to consider active regulatory and legislative support to push the needle on some of these technologies being rapidly adopted? And of course, sustainability financing. What do you think can be done by RBI, SEBI, and other government bodies to provide active support? I would love to hear from the panelists.
I would just make 3 bullet points and then let's leave it for the other. One is obviously, as you saw in Delhi many years ago, they said, you only can have biofuel, the 3-wheelers, you cannot have, ICE 3-wheelers, which again is a way of saying, look, let's use, I guess, biofuels, or, you look at that. Secondly, you have also had the government come up with legislation that old cars, you cannot keep on having old cars. So there is a timeline to cars. So saying, look, you can't have these guys emitting more and more carbon. In a way, and in terms of EVs as well, and I think this is the point about energy transitions globally, as to whenever you transition into a new, new zone, the government needs to support it, which is what it's doing for EVs, subsidizing it by 20%. Obviously, this is a near-term measure to say, look, we want to encourage EVs, we want to encourage rooftop solar by giving subsidies. So I think the government can be an influencer, but can they mandate? I think they can mandate only on the negative side that, if your car is 20 years old, you can't keep on using it if it is emitting more. But the influencing has to come from an individual in terms of, I guess, combination of his knowledge, comfort, and behavior change, and obviously an acknowledgement as to what am I doing towards sustainability. I mean, this is not something where you leave it to others. I mean, what can we all do to make that marginal contribution?
I'll go with the government thing. I think the government is doing a fabulous job, to be honest. Although we have been subject to some very random decision making by the government. For example, one of our grants from 6 years ago is still stuck in the bank because the government won't let us use it, even though energy efficiency is a national priority. That aside, the government is doing a great job. It's sending really good signals to the market. It's encouraging innovation, the good long-term policies, forward thinking. They're involving the right people, right? Niti Aayog is working with Rocky Mountain Institute. I mean, you couldn't think of that 5 years ago, but that's great. It's happening now. So they have the right advisors, the right people around the table, which is great. They're making good policy. I think one thing the government can do a lot more is walk the talk. They are a huge demand center, and they need to aggressively adopt climate solutions at scale. They can easily call up, the power minister can call up the big oil, gas company and say, okay, you do this in all your stations, you need to put charging. I mean, they can really go forward, adopt good clean technologies, and I would say that's the area where there's not enough action yet. Policy making wise, I think thumbs up to the government.
Yeah, my two cents on this would be that, I mean, government has more than just negative mandates capability through policy. Procurement policy is the most powerful thing we've used in energy innovation in the recent decades. The United States is a good example of that. Renewable portfolio standards have been what have driven market growth. We've just passed building codes here in California that basically make every new commercial building built require solar and be electric everything by requirement. Even if they have a gas stove in them, they have to be wired for a non-gas stove from construction. That sort of mandate means that the entrepreneurs can flow in and compete with the gas guys and provide the induction stove that's better, cheaper, etc. Government procurement policy is probably the single biggest hook. And, Department of Defense in this country and in India and many countries could crack the EV nut in, one set of orders. I mean, that's what Biden's doing with the postal fleet. It will change America by booking 750,000 vehicles that will bring to scale US-made batteries and EVs. Like, that's done. So government is the largest and most dynamic actor in the energy transition. We have to stop pretending government is not creative and entrepreneurial. It is. It's just that for the last 50 to 100 years, it's been doing war making and dirty energy support and subsidization. All that has to be reversed in the next 15 years, or else no army can defend us from what is coming with the weather.
So Debashi, would love to hear from you as well on how or what the government could do in addition to the efforts that the oil majors are putting in.
I think in terms of the policies, in terms of frameworks, I think there's been a lot that has already been done. And I think in terms of for example, looking at how the startup ecosystem can be enabled, I think a lot of action has been done. A lot of the Startup India or the Invest India platforms have been created, and I think we work very closely with those Startup India platforms and Invest India platforms, and really kind of see where we can bring in this view of energy transition and helping the energy startups, and really take advantage in a sense that they make them mature enough to go and take advantage of these opportunities which are emerging from various initiatives that have been launched, for example, be it smart cities or wherever it is coming up. And at least from that view, we are kind of enabling from the Share Leaf standpoint, and making the startups mature, making them kind of, when I say mature, I mean in terms of the deployment side of things, and giving them those opportunities to really scale up. I think that is where we want to really play a more important role as we kind of go ahead also. But definitely in terms of policies, frameworks, we see a lot of things which has already happened, and I'm sure it will continue to happen as we go ahead.
I agree with most of the points there, Debashish. I think that's where the ESG mandates and the enforcement of compliance make a lot of sense, especially where in ESG in real estate. ESG mandates are present, but strictly not as complied by many of the buildings or many in the commercial real estate sector, especially, which is where probably I think Anjana could help us understand a little bit more, and perhaps Arjun can also chime in on what's happening in the ESG sector in the real estate, because that is a major needle mover in the decarbonization space. So perhaps Anjana.
Vikram, I'd just like to comment a bit on the policy aspect of that before I move into ESG in real estate. Government is not just the only actor when they implement a policy. The uptake, deployment, implementation of the policy on ground also is one of the challenges that is seen. So even if we make a petition to the government to change a policy, there are also a lot of other actors and players that come into play. Like there's the Satat scheme that's been in place, there is a FAME scheme that has come in, but are we enabling the ecosystem? Are we creating enough entrepreneurs, or are we creating enough adopters of those technologies is also a question that we need to ask instead of, I think kudos to the government. They've come up with policies that are in line with the NDCs, at least our commitments to the NDC. So actually the government has taken a step ahead in doing that, but we need to really enable the ecosystem to adopt that. In fact, we need to look at the emissions profiles or the energy intensity of the largest consumers of the country and help them decarbonize and help them in their low carbon energy pathways to actually bring down the energy intensity.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think the government has got a perform a cheap trade scheme in place. So the largest 600 polluters in India have a mandate to reduce their consumption over the next 3 years. And then if they overachieve it, they can trade the energy saving certificates. The sad part is there is no value to the certificates, but hopefully in the future it will come. So I agree with the point on implementation and having some more meat around the policies. But your question about real estate is also a very interesting one. I think it's a very important one. So one of our investors is actually a real estate company, and they're also one of our customers. So it's very funny, like some of the top, so it's a very differentiated market. The top real estate players are definitely getting a lot of pressure from their investors, which are big global funds, to do more with respect to ESG. So earlier it was only reporting, now it is action. So they are getting more pressure to act on ESG, not just report. There are some really big structural problems. Like I'll just tell you one problem which is kind of mind-blowing. We approached one of the largest real estate companies in the whole country, which is invested in by one of the largest PE funds in the whole world. And we say, okay, we can guarantee you 30% reduction in your entire buildings, in your entire building stock in the whole country. You don't have to invest anything. They say, okay, we have no incentive to save energy, because we recover the exact energy that our tenants are consuming, we recover from. So in fact, we have zero incentive economic incentive to actually go for this. So why should we, right? It's a cost plus. Energy is one of my costs, and I don't want to. So I was just like, wow, okay, well, because there is this pressure coming from the top, but the bottom line of these companies are not yet aligned with making the right choice when it comes to sustainability of their facilities. And I think we need to figure out how to crack that problem for a big shift to actually happen, because the technology solutions are there, the financing solutions are there. This is a structural kind of problem in how billing is done. And I don't know how to, we have to solve that problem. But it is on its way.
I think those points are bang on, Arjun, because when the problem of real estate ownership is separated from the energy consumer, then whose problem is it really, and who does the service provider address? That has been a recurring theme across the energy efficiency and the solar space. I couldn't agree with you more. But having said all of this, I think we are now approaching the closing thoughts for the session. there still seems to be a very noticeable gap in deep tech innovations in India, especially in the climate and the energy space compared to the Western markets. We still see a lot of proprietary technologies come across from the US and the European markets, as well as I'm sure Danny would agree as well. This could be partially attributed to the appetite of local investors, could also be attributed to the lack of innovation talent in the ecosystem in India. But what do you think could be done to strengthen this a little bit more, to give rise to more deep tech innovations coming from our country? I think we could use Danny's perspective on this to start with.
Look, I mean, more of the sort of entrepreneurial support organization activity that New Energy Nexus does with the Climate Collective in India, I think is critical. Creating spaces and support the sustainability mafia, I think, is what Arjun's created. This talent question is a kind of a human problem. Like, there's a lot of smart kids coming up in India with incredible education, like unparalleled, to any previous generation, because of all the information they have at their fingertips and all the other things, notwithstanding COVID and some setbacks in the recent past. But we need to engage all those millions of minds in the great exercise of our time. And to do that, we have to encourage them and support them to take risk on their careers, and culturally, I can't speak for India, but I know here and elsewhere, it's very hard to decide to throw down and try to be an innovator and do something that everyone says is not possible and is insurgent against incumbency, and do that work. And they need support, not just from sort of like conventional educational institutions, but the sort of incubators, accelerators, communities of practice that, the electron vibe thing is becoming for the startups disrupting the discom space, or the Women in Energy program that we've launched with New Energy Nexus India. Not to brag on them, but I think they're doing exactly right, to address the gender imbalance and to engage the half of the whole population that has sort of historically been left out of this conversation, i.e. women, who also happen to be major decision makers about individual and consumption decisions and all the rest. We've got to run programs and build support mechanisms and invest in proactively money, but also time and effort and connections and networks, all those people. And that comes through organizations like ours and IIC and all the wonderful work you're all involved with. We've just got to do more of it.
Yeah, I think, Vikram, I couldn't agree more with Danny, actually, in terms of saying that, look, you need more of the Shell e-force to support more and more entrepreneurs. I think today, even from where we sit, we obviously need more capital to fund the various initiatives that we see coming before us, because otherwise you have a cutoff based on amount available versus talent to be funded. And I think, broadly speaking, I think, I would sort of venture a comment that, look, the next set of unicorns will come from energy. I think the days of the SaaS are done, fintech. No, I wouldn't say done, but they are in the mature space. But I would say that, India, if the talent pool that has been going towards SaaS, if even a fraction of it changes focus and is moved towards, I think the problem is focus. I think, IPCC report August 2021, if that is not an eye opener, then I don't know what will be. But if people say, look, this is a serious problem and we are in it together and we got to do something about it. Once that line is crossed, then if you see, as is rightly pointed out by Danny, and I would wholeheartedly say that India has a pool of talented people, but they are not involved in this space. I think there need to be more involvement in this space and thinking deeply we can solve this problem. I don't think it's a case to give up, but it is a case to say, look, inaction is expensive and we got to do something about it.
Thank you, Samir.
I have a suggestion here. So I've been lucky to be part of this deep tech innovation ecosystem while I was in the US as a student. And, it's a different ballgame out here. I've been visiting all the universities over the past few years out here to see what's going on. And it's just a completely different world. I mean, in the Berkeleys and the MITs of the world, you've got the big oil companies with the hundreds of millions of dollars in energy initiatives and all this stuff. Here, if you go, there's one IIT Madras Research Park, which has $20 million and that's it. And that also was a fight for one professor who made it his personal mission to make it. Right? How many innovation ecosystem centers are there? Research parks are there? There's none. We need 50 of them if we want to create big companies, right? And then I think the big Indian companies have to realize that and start investing at the university level in professors and research centers where students can actually do the research and get PhD students can get paid and not, the PhD students out here struggle, right? They don't know where to stay. Like they don't have money for their housing and their food. The PhD students in the US are living great lives because they are funded. They know for 7 years I can do this research and this company from Italy or anywhere else is going to fund my research for 7 years and I don't have to worry about where that's going to come from. If that kind of long-term support and visibility is not provided to our professors and our PhD students, we are going to stay far behind in terms of deep tech. We are very creative in terms of coming up with solutions using existing tech, but in terms of actual technical innovation, I think right now we are at least 3 decades behind. And one suggestion to Mr. Devashish here from Shell: just pour your dollars into some of the good universities that we have and try to create 10 IIT Madras research parks over the next 2-3 years, and then we'll see a lot of good companies coming out.
No, absolutely. I think just to add on, if I may, just a couple of points. I think what we as a part of EFA, what we are also trying to do now is actively work with the institutional ecosystem. So we are very we are trying to expand that reach and not only a few of the IITs, but even beyond to that also, so that we spread the outreach in terms of enabling some of the early stage entrepreneurs, and also working with them to give them the opportunity to further build on their ideas through some of the mechanisms we are trying to build internally. So that is something which definitely we are trying to do. Another add-on is that what we felt was that there is need for there's a lot of activity happening in isolation right now. We need to build a more stronger alliances and partnerships with maybe peer companies or even the whole community of innovation ecosystem partners to really create skill from that partnership view as well, so that we can then go out and together create an impact by leveraging each other's competences. I think that is also another aspect which I think if we can build more such alliances and forums which are focused around clean tech or clean mobility as a value chain, definitely those things will also help us going forward. And we definitely will be very interested in that as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Devashish. I think with that, we have come to almost the end of our time. I would really appreciate the time that the panelists have taken out and the opportunity by IIC and Climate Collective for us to enable this session. So, Ranjana, over to you. Ranjana?
Sorry about that. I think Shreya, please take it ahead. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. This was surely a very, very compelling discussion. Thanks, Vikram, for your excellent moderation. And thank you, lovely panelists, for throwing light on some very crucial points, like how energy startups have the potential to scale through appropriate ecosystem support and the need to build capacity of new innovative startups which can support the transition from current energy sources.